morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone tuning in for the latest edition of QTalks, an online on-demand series of conversations powered by Katium. My name is Tom Freyberg. I'm an environmental journalist and content creator specializing in water, and I'll be your host for the next 25 minutes. So for today's topic of QTalks, we are talking about open data in water. And to discuss this further, we have assembled a fantastic panel of experts for you here today. We are joined by Nigel Watson, who is the CIO of Northumbrian Water Group, Gavin Starks, who is the former chief executive of the ODI, the Open Data Institute, and currently the founder and CEO of Icebreaker One, and also Lewis Richards, who is the CTO for the UK water industry at Microsoft. So Nigel, Gavin and Lewis, thanks for joining us, and thrilled to have you and look forward to this discussion on open data. So we want to sort of just get going before we sort of get into perhaps the pros and the cons of this approach, this philosophy. And what it comes down to is the C word, the collaboration, that, it's a word that we hear time and time again at different conferences, at different industries, that we need to collaborate to sort of solve these mega challenges. But why would you sort of, as way of an introduction, think that now is the right time and actually it's a necessity for collaboration in water? Maybe sort of Nigel from Northumbrian, you can kick us off if you will.
Yeah, I think collaboration is essential within our sector. And as I was talking the other day, I think the pace of change, whilst maybe not as fast as it is in other industries, it's coming at us quicker than ever. Changes in customers' expectations, changes in our employees' expectations, but probably more than anything, changes to the climate itself and how that's impacting how we operate our assets. So it suggests to me that we need to collaborate. I think there's some evidence there that we can as well. So I chair a forum of water company CIOs, and we gather 3-4 times a year, and there's a lot of learning that gets passed around the group. Definitely. You've got Stream sitting in the middle of the UK water industry and sharing knowledge around innovation. And I guess the innovation competition itself coming from Ofwat and them signalling to us very strongly that bids should have multiple parties on them, including multiple water companies. And, we're seeing just several rounds in now where that's really starting to happen. So I think we need to do it, definitely. It's a value for money thing as well. But there's some evidence there that we can.
Very good. So multiple kind of drivers, not only in the face of the changes from climate change, you've got the sort of the regulator as well, driving that as well. And also it's sort of there's just this necessity all around that we need to collaborate to solve these challenges. So let's bring in Lewis then from Microsoft, because you work with multiple different sort of water utilities and you've recently sort of united different teams together as part of an event yourself. So collaboration in water, why is now the time this needs to happen?
I think I'd echo what Nigel said. I think it has to be outcome focused more than anything else if we're going to address these macro challenges. And it's more for me, it's a speed issue really. As a technology provider, we provide collaboration capability, but we've got to accelerate the ecosystem that exists around the collaboration. It's an easy word to say, it's a harder thing to do, really. And I think what we're starting to see is this drive towards openness and acceptance. I think that's the opportunity for the water industry, really. It's to kind of really open everybody's eyes, the public's eyes as well, really, to the complicated ecosystem that exists around water. So extending beyond the boundaries of the water companies themselves. I think as a technology provider, obviously, we work very closely with not just the water companies, but with the regulators, with all of the other players that exist around the ecosystem. So we have I'd say almost not a unique view, but a trusted view, I think, of the opportunity to do more with data on platforms.
Thanks, Lewis. Now let's bring in the perspective then of Gavin from your time at the kind of the top of the ODI and now sort of looking beyond, certainly beyond the water industry in terms of this urgency and this need for collaboration right now. Can you maybe sort of give us a bit of your experience on that?
Certainly. I think there's a few things here about why collaboration's essential. Firstly, today's the simplest it's going to be. We've got, within the sector, we've got a huge move towards digitized systems. So the importance of investing in the long term here for how we're going to deal with digitized and interoperable systems. And as has been mentioned, we've got many connected challenges here: climate change, nature and ecosystems emergencies left, right and center. And so we need to get a lot smarter about what we're doing, and we need to do it quickly. And particularly with climate, the time is over really we need to act, and we need to go far together and quickly. So the challenge there for everyone is, how can we go far together and go quickly, given there's lots of commercial interests and sensitivities in the mix, and everyone is at a different stage of the maturity curve around data and digitalization. So there, I think one of the opportunities here, if we think about the benefits of open approaches, is you can take the leaders can move quickly and encourage and help those who are struggling to get onto the curve of data and digitalization. Everyone can effectively raise the bar on what's pre-competitive. And it can be quite a delicate conversation a lot of the time to say, really the outcome we're looking for here is more efficient systems, more interconnected systems within the water sector. But again, as has been mentioned, more connectivity with other sectors and other parts of the commercial ecosystem, so that we can all become more environmentally sound in what we're doing. And the benefit of working on that pre-competitive space and collaboration is that we can get to the end game faster. That we should be competing on quality of service, on efficiencies, on analytics, rather than the underlying access to data. That, underlying access to data, it's effectively being commoditized, and we need to move further up the value chain.
Great, thank you, Gavin. I mean, you certainly stressed the urgency and that we need to sort of collaborate more quickly. Moving on to then sort of getting into a bit more detail on this open data approach, this philosophy, this kind of goal. Nigel, Northumbrian's been quite progressive in sort of taking a lead on this. So can you talk about from a water utility perspective, the key drivers then to sort of be at the forefront of this open data approach?
I think firstly, we felt that someone needed to take a step forward. And since we are relatively mature in the curve, we've invested a lot of money in digital technology over the last 7 or 8 years. So we felt we were well positioned to do that. But then it comes back to climate change again, mostly. And the question I asked my peers on the exec team is, are we going to sit here and learn from the weak signals that we might have in our own data, or are we going to try and open up industry-wide data sets and learn collaboratively together? And I think, there's only one possible answer to that question. It makes zero sense to sit there and try and learn from what might be, especially at times, sparse data sets, right? When you have the opportunity to reach out to the rest of the industry and gather so much more rich insight.
Because even though each UK utility is noticeably different in terms of population, demographic, the location, there's arguably a lot of commonalities within water utilities, right, in terms of assets, pumps, pipes, network, where it just makes sense to sort of share and work together on the learnings and the innovations around those parts of the network.
Exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I think there are commonalities and there are differences, and it's important that you understand both, because, there's no point us looking at some data from, let's say, Southwest Water, which is in the opposite part of the country to us, and then saying, well, we can directly apply it when there might be obvious temperature differences or different, other differences that would be meaningful to the area performance that we're trying to analyze. But at the same time, we fundamentally provide the same services. We're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with society, and so there is definitely an awful lot that we can learn from each other.
And in terms of the broader sort of common goals, there's the net zero targets as well that everyone's working towards, and that will need innovation and that collaboration as well. So, Gavin, let's bring in actually Lewis on this. In terms of working with multiple utilities then, where do you sort of see the main drivers for this open data approach?
I think it's one of there's been a general trend towards transformation over the last couple of years since I've been at Microsoft anyway, and I think the actual industry itself has transformed a lot in terms of its adoption of digital technologies, this kind of thing. And I think it's now that outside-in perspective as well. And I think from a Microsoft perspective, we're trying to be that pivot point a little bit. We have things like the planetary computer that we use, which is a huge global set of biological data. And we're particularly interested, I think, with our own things like our water positivity goals by 2030, these big kind of adaptive changes that we see as a business, then it's in our interest as well to kind of foment that sharing as well and bring those kind of cross-industry examples as well. And because it all comes to an outcome at the end, everybody's trying to do the same thing. Everybody's got the right idea in the right way. And I think acting as a pivot point is quite useful. So because we sit and everybody uses our technology as well, so we can be that pivot point between maybe the regulators in terms of a desire to understand at a macro level what the data is, to the individual companies who are producing and are learning those steps around what they mean by trusted data and what are they happy to share, down to the major agricultural producers or the major pharmaceutical companies. We sit in the mix of a lot of those, I think. So bringing some of those lessons and some of that outside-in thinking to water as well is quite useful, because we're able to kind of help to bring to life use cases and stories of where you've seen the benefit of taking an open approach. At the Open Data Forum that we hosted, working alongside Nigel and the team a couple of weeks back, we brought in one of the product managers from GitHub, which is the largest, repository of open source technology on the planet. And he talked about what NASA had benefited by opening up Hubble Space Telescope data, historical data sets, and the sheer amount of human invention and development that's come back from opening up data sets it's awe-inspiring. When you see the practical instantiation of trust around data sets. And I think he's just trying to do a bit more of that, really, for the benefit of us all, really, for society.
And there's also no greater example than space exploration and the stars to sort of, provide an incentive and sort of example of another business as well. So, Gavin, I was sort of just doing a bit of research before the session, and in one of your interviews at the ODI, there's this great quote that I pulled that I want to just read out, and it says, "By the time the change is happening, it's too late for large organizations to adapt, so they need to take a step into what may feel like a very unknown space to begin with. If they don't, a lot of their core value could be completely undermined in 10 years. And this was speaking perhaps much more broadly across UK business as a whole. But specifically, kind of, where do you see it sort of working with Nigel previously as some of the sort of main drivers then for this open data approach within water, sort of separate to the key drivers of climate change?
Well, I think there's a number of elements there. It's great to hear astronomy quotes, because I used to work at the Jodrell Bank Radio Telescope as an astrophysicist, so it's nice to bring that back into the mix. But the opportunity here really is that we are creating radically new ways of creating insights. And so the technology stack is effectively commoditized. It's incredibly straightforward to get hold of the data, to publish it, and to make it usable. But we're in the middle of that transition right now, and groupings like Stream are working on that at an industry-wide scale. But that's really the starting point. It's, if you like, the foundation stone, and the mention there of trust. One of the things we do at Icebreaker One is we have an assurance process for data and organizations. We have a thing called a trust framework for publishing data, which organizations in the energy sector are now starting to use, like SSE. And really, when we're moving forward here, one of the elements of how do you build trust in these ecosystems is incredibly important. Unlike software, the data carries insight. It's not just, they're not just sort of tools, as it were. They're things that you're going to use, and as Nigel mentioned, you need to use in different ways for different situations. And so there needs to be some way of instilling trust in the publication, and most importantly, actually, trust in the maintenance of that information. If you look at data.gov.uk, which is the first national data portal in the world when it first launched, the effort wasn't necessarily in getting it out there, it was making sure it was maintained. And so whether that's a process of certification or assurance and so on, those processes are really going to come to the fore. But the driver there, coming back to your reference on the quote, is we've seen other sectors being digitized. Obviously, the web is 30 years old, decades old. And every sector that has been affected effectively by the internet and by the web has gone through a massive transformation. And so there's substantial risks in the mix there of what is a water company. And we see that, in, say, banking. I co-chaired the development of the open banking standard. That's completely transformed the way that banking works across the country. We're running open energy at the moment. We're seeing similar systemic challenges and changes there. And I think this is coming to all sectors. And this is kind of partly driven also by national policy. In the UK, we've got the data bill that's going through Parliament at the moment. And there's a group called the Smart Data Council there, which is looking at how is customer data, whether that's individual consumers or small businesses, how are they going to interact with all this huge amount of data that's going to be made available? And so for a couple of weeks ago, I'm co-chairing that group as well, alongside Minister Hollenrake. And all of these questions are writ large. How are we going to build effectively the web of data so that it's interoperable within sectors and across sectors, and in a way that it's fair? There has to be reciprocity in the system. You can't just have a situation where people publish data and then everybody else consumes it and doesn't give anything back. One of the most common phrases I heard at the Open Data Institute when I was running that was, we'd love it if everybody else published their data as long as we don't have to. But that doesn't create reciprocity, right? So that's why this is coming back to the point of collaboration. Everyone needs to step together. Otherwise, you end up creating a lot of friction in those systems. And in some cases, it will require legislation and regulation. And we're starting to see that as well in in other sectors.
I think part of collaboration has to be two-way, right? There has to be the giving and the taking in order for it to succeed from all parties involved. And you mentioned some good examples there, Gavin, of energy as well as finance. One of the words you mentioned there was sort of trust and also interoperability, the ability to sort of connect to multiple systems. So let's sort of jump to the final part of the discussion I want to allow enough time for, and that's really on perhaps the challenges and the bottlenecks within water, potentially around sort of data concerns, privacy concerns that perhaps have prevented as much progress as we would have liked to have seen. And so, Nigel, let's hear from you then, where you sort of see perhaps the historic kind of bottlenecks and challenges as to why this open data approach in water hasn't moved as quickly as we perhaps needed it to.
Yeah, I think it would be challenges that from conversations I've had with Gavin, he would have seen elsewhere. So there's concerns I hear from some companies about data quality, right? Definitely. Sometimes I hear, that data's ours. And I guess that goes back to the reciprocity and the value that we can get in from pooling the data. I think our own concern is the data is quite complex sometimes and quite technical and has to be understood in context, right? And so it's just making sure when we put that data out there that there's sufficient metadata that goes with the data and sufficient education that goes with it as well, so that people know what they're doing when they receive the data, can form hypotheses safely, and then can come back with some meaningful innovations. And we've done that in a physical environment. So we've run probably more than 10 data hacks. We typically run these at our festival, where we've put 10 years worth of data about pollutions, leakage, flooding, etc. into an environment, and had subject matter experts on hand for data scientists to consult with. And we've had tremendous insights from that. And so really what we're doing now is saying, okay, we're going to try and find a way to replicate that, but asynchronously. And I'm sure, we'll learn some lessons when we do. Gavin mentioned the data release process that was developed for the energy sector, and we've taken that as a starting point. So we'll adhere to that process, put data out there. And I mean, I'm sure, there'll be some times when we early on when we publish a particular data set that it might be misinterpreted. Could be, and obviously the fact that we're very much in the media at the moment does make people a bit nervous. But we'll get past that. We will get past that, definitely.
And that's part of the innovation with this, though, right, Nigel? If you're releasing the data set that perhaps, there may need to be refinements and improvements, that's part of perhaps leading the way on this as a utility.
I think, yeah. I mean, you can see in other sectors, again, it has enabled heaps of innovation in energy and in banking and other sectors. So we're confident that we'll see something similar to that in our sector.
Very good, thank you. All right, so Lewis, in terms of, again, working agnostically with alongside other and different water utilities, where have you sort of from your conversations seen the kind of the historic challenges and bottlenecks? Would you echo what Nigel said there?
Yeah, to a large degree. I think it's that pattern we see across all industries, really, where, data teams are often the early adopters of sort of like, in our world, cloud technologies as well. But that sometimes can go from being an ivory tower type estate becoming a mainstream capability. So there's always a pathway that goes on to, and sometimes that can take a while to break down. I think the water industry is making great gains on that at the moment. I think the interesting thing for me, there's two things that are interesting for me at the moment, I think, is one is that if you look at the Open Data Initiative, the Open Data Forum, which is led by the regulator Ofwat, obviously, and which is what Streams tried to help create. It goes back to Nigel's point about it's the visibility within the organisations of the water companies as well. It's like that everybody at the senior enough level appreciates what it means to be an open data as an industry. Do you know what I mean? Because it's very operationally led businesses, and getting that agreement and understanding about what everybody's signing up to for open data will be quite key, especially if you look at then the transformational wave that we're going through at the moment in society with, and I'm going to say the word because obviously I'm the technologist from Microsoft on the call, but if you think about generative AI and the impact that's having in the way that humans interact with computers, where it's language based, and it's less about collaboration now, it's more about accessibility. Data is going to become more understandable by the machines and the humans who interact with that. So that it's going to place even more pressures, I think, on industries to really be happy with trusting what they share as well. So it has to be led from the board down. The CEOs have got to sign up to this stuff. They've really got to understand the impact of the data that they share, the opportunity for that. And then they've got to buy into that trust piece as well, really, for it to have, that kind of, that wider effect on society, I think. And it's really fascinating place to be at this point in time, I think. There's a couple of inflection points all happening at the same time.
Yeah, if I might just come back in on that, I mean, I think, we published an open data strategy, which is largely centered on what we're doing on Stream, but goes beyond to some regional collaborations that we want to have with sectors that we rub shoulders with. And we did that. So, I started that at our exec team and took it back, and we're all signed up to that. And so we do appreciate there are some risks, right? But we think the opportunities are worth it.
So getting the executive team and the CEO involved sort of from the early days and throughout the strategy is really fundamental for the companies as well.
CEO signed off on that strategy.
I think Northumbrian leading the way there. I mean, launching that and getting that agreed as Creative Commons licensing and leased out and pushes it's a really fantastic model for everybody else to kind of lift up, and don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, you just lean into what's been done and build on the top of that. I think it's fantastic.
Good. Let's bring in then Gavin for the sort of final word on this section in terms of overcoming bottlenecks and the need for the sort of CEOs to get involved, to understand, to sort of lead and be a part of the strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to maybe start with a couple of very important points. Privacy was mentioned there, for example. Open data is never personal data. So that's the ODI defines very clearly open data as data that anyone can use for any purpose for free. Right. So that's not everything. But in order to do that, you've got to have a really robust process to get everybody, particularly the lawyers and compliance folks, to be really crystal clear that it's okay to publish, and that there are clear licenses around that. Trust is still important around that in terms of the maintenance of the data and its ongoing, effectively service level agreement that enables it to be trusted and used in analytics and decision making. And then beyond that, what we're seeing is this evolution towards more of data sharing infrastructure. And that's where the data that does need some other more restrictive kind of license around it, restrictive rules around it, need to be agreed at a industry-wide level. And that's what we see in the banking sector, what we're seeing in the energy sector, and now what we're seeing through the leadership in Stream, is how can we get to those common licensing agreements, which sounds very dry, but really at the heart of this is, do I have the permission to use the data for the purposes that I need to use it for? And that's where it comes away from being a technical challenge. It's no longer a technical challenge to publish data and get it out there. It is a legal challenge and it's a policy challenge. And that's why it's different parts of the organization. So this comes back to how do we go far together? And for that, we do need C-suite buy-in. It needs to be led as a strategic priority for the business. In the same way that, going back to your earlier quote, industries who've embraced digital properly from the top down have survived, and ones that haven't even necessarily survived. And so this is really it's a large transformation of how businesses work. And just to bring in one other lever there on the environmental side, there is now mandatory reporting coming to all of the financial sector. So the information from the real economy must now start to flow in an assurable way from the real economy into the financial economy in a way that it hasn't had to before. And that's going to affect risk management, it's going to affect people's insurance policies, it's going to affect capital allocation plans, and all of those conversations are wildly different from talking about technology. So I think elevating this conversation to this is a board level conversation that needs to happen. It needs to be enabled by good quality, trustworthy data, but it's going to affect every single part of the business, and it's going to happen quickly.
Very good. Thank you, Gavin. Yeah, as you quite rightly said, it's not necessarily around the tools. We know there's digital advancements in sensing data sets are available, but actually it's around the people, the politics, and the kind of the policy as well. So,
I think just to build on that, the data is not necessarily going to come from within your organization. It's going to be measured by other people. And so if you're not collaborating, if you don't have an open collaboration at the foundation of that, then you're more likely to be blindsided by something and not have as
to
control
partner
as
with additional organizations on this to make it work. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Very good. Well, gentlemen, that's all we've got time for today. QTalks always sort of to the point, short and sweet, sort of address the potential and the challenges as well. So really interesting viewpoints from the three of you. And for people tuning in and sort of interested in knowing more, there is a follow-up white paper being released by KTM on sort of open data across water. So it's worth checking out. So yeah, a big thanks to Gavin, Nigel and Lewis for taking part in the QTalks on open data, and encourage you to tune in for future episodes coming very shortly. So gentlemen, thank you very much.